Hello there. Welcome to the GP Rejects Teammate Collision podcast for another episode. I'm here with my wonderful colleague Lennart, as always.
Hello, everyone. It is a lovely day today, and today's episode of the Teammate Collision is a very special one because we are not just two teammates colliding this time, but three. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our third teammate today, a man both excellent in streaming video games and in music, none other than Daniel.
Hi everyone. Yeah, here we are. I guess if this is teammate collection, I would be the test driver. Given my given my age, I thought I would be Kanogni-sani. That would be a good analogy there.
Yeah, we're going back to the 1970s, I think, because I don't think there has been three teammates since. When was the most recent team which had a three-car team which was allowed?
That was Renault in the mid 80s when they had one car additionally to test the T cam. But of course, we could just go with the lower series where three driver teams are still the standard, at least in Formula 3.
Do we know any famous teammate collisions in Formula 3?
We could find one, but we don't have the time for that. So we won't. Anyway, Daniel, tell us a bit more about yourself. How did you get into Formula 1 along with the aforementioned other interests of video game streaming? A link to his channel is in the description. So,
yeah. So my interest in Formula 1 started very very early in my life, when about 6 years old. Funnily through video games, because I got a video game console for Christmas, and it came with a copy of Super Monaco GP. So first thing I learned about Formula 1 was probably all of the circuits of the 1989 Formula 1 season through that video game. And then I started learning about the big drivers of the time that would appear in the media. So we're talking, of course, Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell. And then when I grew up a little bit, after the death of Ayrton Senna, I've started watching Formula 1 full time, like reading everything that I could, watching every race, even practice sessions live. So yeah, from then on, it was about just a full-time thing for me, watching it.
And when it comes to rejects, what are your favorite? First of all, who is your favorite reject driver, and what is your favorite reject moment?
All right, so this is a very good question because there's so much to choose from. I say that my favorite reject driver is probably Jean-Denis Delatraz. It's because he was so comically slow that it's incredible that in such a professional era of Formula 1, such a driver could go into a Grand Prix and just run like that 10 seconds off the pace. And that was accepted. So, and he got a super license. So that's kind of an amazing story.
It's an inspiring story when you think about it.
Yeah, actually, the other day I answered in some online forum a similar question, but it was about your the question was your favorite Formula 1 pairing of the 90s. My answer was Hideki Noda and Jean-Denis Delatraz in the 1994 Australian Grand Prix, because it's such an amazing lineup to have driving for your team.
I remember writing the profile of Hideki Noda and I remember that it was just like, I think Jean-Denis Delatraz was unsurprisingly the only teammate who Hideki Noda was faster than, and he was like 2 seconds faster. But I think it was Eric Comas was his previous teammate who had been something like 2 seconds faster than Noda. So in the space of like 2 races, the team had gone basically on average like 3 seconds a lap slower in qualifying.
Just through driver choice, it's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing what an empty wallet does to someone.
Yeah, so a favorite reject moment. This is also so much to choose from. Okay, I'll sort of say just one of the first things that come to mind. And it needs to be uh, Perry McCarthy. The picture of Perry McCarthy sees him at the side port of the Andrea Moda on the pit exit of the Barcelona circuit in pre-qualifying in 1992. That's such an iconic moment that made the cover of his book. So, yeah, it's
Nice. Very nice. Good answers. I like both of those answers. Daniel is joining us here today. We usually have I would say a much more orderly set of subjects which Lennart and I prepare for, but because there's three of us and there's going to be a way more discursive talking, I think, in the way that we're doing this, we have a couple of ideas, a couple of subjects that we're going to broach today, and we're just going to see where we go with it. For the first thing that we have is that I picked up about a week or two ago Maurice Hamilton's book on Niki Lauda, which was released about a year or so after Lauda's death. And I had a book voucher, and I saw it on hardback, a really nice edition in one of my local bookshops, and picked it up and gave it a read and absolutely loved it. And I thought it would be fantastic to talk about not just why the book is interesting, but also why Lauda, of course, himself is interesting. Not a reject, of course, but why his life is interesting and what it meant for the time of Formula One as a whole. And also how safety measures have increased since then. And I think that's going to be our, so to speak, what we're going to speak about afterwards. And we have a little surprise subject in mind at the end if we still have time for it. But yeah, maybe I could introduce our first subject, which is the Niki Lauda biography by Maurice Hamilton. It's a really fantastic book. It's probably the best Formula One book or motorsport book that I've ever read. Mainly because it has so much in the way of interviews and, so to speak, narrative building from everyone in Niki Lauda's life. From perspective, so many of these motorsport books are usually ghostwritten by racing drivers themselves and their agents, who racing drivers are usually expressing it and they're being put into written form in a ghostwritten way, the way most celebrities do. But in Lauda's biography, because it's being written by someone who's known him for something like 40 years or so, that they had at least a professional relationship with one another, this guy has been able to build up all these chronicles of interviews with Max Mosley, Bernie Ecclestone, Alain Prost, all these characters from his life, and build up this really, really rich book. Daniel, I mentioned this a week or so back, and you actually picked up the book yourself. I wanted to know what you thought of it.
Yes, I've been pretty much fast reading it because I only picked it up on last Friday, so that was 5 days ago at this moment, and I've been also busy with other stuff over the weekend. So yeah, I've pretty much had to rush through it a little bit, but yeah, I find it amazing, the all the stories that are in the book, all of the facts that are explained. It's an impressive biography. For being a biography, is extremely entertaining and insightful into who Niki Lauda was as a character, as a driver, and as a person. Also talks pretty much about his private life and his endeavors out of Formula One as well. So yeah, you can get a very, very good idea through the book about Niki Lauda, and yeah, it's great.
I'm happy to hear you like it. I don't know whereabouts are you in his career, out of interest. So I will be spoiling the second half of the book if you. I don't know whereabouts you are in it.
I think I've read through like 85% of it, so pretty much up to the modern day. So yeah, I think you wouldn't be spoiling too much for me, especially given the subjects that are on.
Yeah,
I was about to say, one could be mean and say, "Oh no, Jeremy is about to spoil Formula One results from the mid '80s."
You know what I mean.
Jeremy is about to spoil who won the 1984 Formula One World Championship now.
The answer may shock you. Yeah. Okay, first interesting thing I thought was, interesting thing I found from the book is actually how the book sort of disembowels the original myth of Hunt and Lauda. James Hunt, of course, like they were fighting each other for the championship, and the myth was kind of built up, especially by the Italian press, who were kind of they were sort of bloodthirsty for a really big battle, which also emphasized and amplified by Ferrari's dealings by constantly basically trying to get McLaren disqualified from every race. And it built up into this narrative by the British and Italian presses that James Hunt and Niki Lauda hated each other, that like they were polar opposites in personalities, that James Hunt was the sex for breakfast driver and Niki Lauda was the cold, calculated professional. And actually the book is really interesting because it's like, no, Niki Lauda got drunk regularly. He also smoked heavily.
But what about sex as breakfast?
I can't comment on that. The book sadly doesn't comment on that. But like how he and James Hunt literally slept in adjoining rooms in their hotel, because in those days, especially when the racetracks were in how do I politely say, the middle of nowhere, usually the drivers were put in a private hotel away from the press so they wouldn't be bothered. But what it meant was that Niki Lauda and James Hunt, either purposefully or not, were literally in adjoining rooms in hotels, so they had the door open all the time. And this comes up basically all the way to Fuji. And it's like, oh, well, maybe they didn't hate each other. Like the idea that Rush, especially as a film, gives you of these two drivers who are like... I think what it really pushed into my mind, which I thought was really amazing, was what a film like Rush does is it makes you feel like these drivers are very much apart from one another, that they live separate lives and that they do their own thing and that they don't really know each other very well. But what the book does, I found was really powerful, is it really makes you understand how much they do know each other and how much they are close to one another. Like they literally have to sleep in the same hotel rooms, at least in those days they did. Like you had to be physically and very personally close to people, even if they didn't like them. Like it talks about how much he didn't really like Carlos Reutemann, for example. But all these people had to be with each other. And I think that's probably the most interesting part of the James Hunt, Niki Lauda myth that actually gets debunked.
Yes, this is a very interesting point that you made, because I guess that you cannot fault the film Rush for doing what it did, because of course it's cinema. Then you need the drama, and you need a storyline. So it's perfectly acceptable that Rush did what it did in the form of a film. But yeah, actually going into the book and reading about this subject is extremely interesting, and how they were constantly also pranking each other all the time. So yes, this is a super insightful thing.
Yeah, I think the only time they actually fell out was after the Canadian Grand Prix, because Ferrari had been basically trying to get McLaren, as I say, disqualified from every race. And it turned out at the Canadian Grand Prix, which was the 14th race out of 16, it turned out Ferrari had been running an illegal part on their, basically attached to their engine the entire season. When of course McLaren were kind of, had their hands on their hips going, wait a second, so should you be disqualified from the entire season so far? And they got a slap on the wrist for it, and Niki Lauda basically said, no, we were entirely innocent, no problems. And Hunt saw that as basically being very hypocritical and very two-faced.
Yeah,
I think that was the only time they actually fell out.
Yeah, well, it comes down from the Ferrari protest about the British Grand Prix, when Lauda got stuck at the exit of the pit lane and James Hunt wasn't disqualified initially after a red flag and coming back to the grid afterwards. So yeah, the animosities started. I think a little bit earlier at the British Grand Prix, but it all kind of imploded in Canada after Ferrari wasn't as clear about the way they had been running the car as they had been pretending when they protested the British Grand Prix result.
And the Spanish Grand Prix as well.
Yeah.
So of course you have to remember, or not to remember, but you have to consider that this is just normal tricking championships contenders always do. Like there's always this, oh no, you're not perfectly legal. Oh no, you're not perfectly legal. I mean, you can pretty much find some variation on it in any actual championship fight that is close.
Mhm.
Just remember that to take the dumbest example and the most recent example of it, that whole thing with Max Verstappen touched Lewis Hamilton's rear wing or whatever it was, front wing, rear wing, it doesn't matter.
Oh, I remember this. This was last year, I think it was, or was it the year before?
2021, which is the year before.
It's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing to me that it's all of these old Formula One seasons are always remembered because of the great races or the battles between drivers or the battles between teams. But one tends to forget the crazy amount of politics involved, even in that era of Formula One. Um, so yeah, all of the politics, and I imagine that if things like that happen today, the social media would explode with this kind of stories going on.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
there's always the thing I talk about, or the thing I bring up when this kind of topic comes up. There's always the 2014 British Grand Prix that comes to mind, where Vettel and Alonso had this huge fight for what was it, P no one cares, and they were bitching up a storm on the team radio, like he pushed me, no, he pushed me, blah blah blah, and it all made them sound very whiny, and everyone was like, oh God, they are whiny. But the thing is, if you had team radio back then, or if you look in the early days of team radio where it wasn't publicly available, I would bet you everything and then some that all the old drivers would also be complaining left and right about everything the other guy did. So
And it's interesting. Like I think we've discussed this before in the past. Where it's like, imagine how crap Senna and Prost would be if you could see the Suzuka 1990 race with team radio with them going over the top of each other. And it's also like nowadays, of course, it's like the Lewis Hamilton knows this more probably better than anyone else, that it's like the team radio is also a public message. It's also a public weapon about, they're talking to their engineer, but they're actually talking to the stewards, for example, or they're trying to get the public on their side. And it's, I'm segueing, of course, from that, but it would be fascinating to like imagine the 1970s world with our current accessibility to how things were then, because especially in those days, the governing body, I don't remember that it wasn't the FIA and it wasn't FISA, but the governing body in those days, when they did make their decisions, it was almost always final. And McLaren, when, for example, they got disqualified from the Spanish Grand Prix, it's like they did protest it, but there was also this thing in the book, and also I've always heard elsewhere, where it's like they also knew how the game was played. And I think in those days, when F1 was more isolated in terms of the garages and people all being so close to one another, there was this kind of fair play, so to speak, that like, okay, our appeal failed, let's move on to the next race. Whereas nowadays you have the public as a weapon.
So, of course, on the topic of politics, I asked you too about that part, or more precisely about whether the story in the book, it's not like Niki Lauda was a foreigner to politics in the Formula One. And my favorite story apparently isn't in the book, in that it concerns the Brabham deal. Namely, there was this thing. Niki Lauda in his final season with Ferrari was paid, according to his own statement, roughly $800,000. And obviously he wanted the 7 digits that some other drivers had. So, joining Brabham, he obviously joined none other than Bernie Ecclestone. And if we know one thing about Bernie Ecclestone, is that he does not have money to throw around. So, obviously, Ecclestone says no. What does Lauda do? He doesn't directly negotiate with him or anything. He just goes to Brabham's main sponsor, Parmalat, the Italian food company, was it? Doesn't matter. And says, yeah, Bernie's not willing to pay me, so I don't know whether I should come or not. obviously, Pamela wants Lauda. So they go to Ecclestone and tell him, give him his money, and if you don't have Lauda, we're not coming. So, and obviously, Ecclestone, as much as he hated it, ended up having to pay Lauda and apparently didn't speak to him for a couple of months after that.
That connects really well with another biography that I read recently, which is Damon Hill's autobiography, Watching the Wheels. And yeah, this is the story when he signed for Jordan. That basically he went to Benson and Hedges, and basically they circumvented Eddie Jordan in the decision making of the driver lineup for 1998. So Eddie Jordan was fuming when he found about he didn't have any say on the signing of Damon Hill for the team. Of course, he was glad afterwards to have Damon in, but yeah, initially he didn't make that choice. Benson and Hedges pretty much made that choice for him. So
Yeah.
it's curious how how a story tends to repeat itself.
Yeah, that is this thing with many team bosses, both from that era and I should also say today, that they don't even mind so much being told to get a star or to get some old time or proven veteran or whatever. That's a lot more bothers them that they had the power taken out of their hand. Of course, this ties into the famous story of Nigel Mansell's 1995 driver McLaren, which apparently neither Mercedes nor McLaren actually wanted back then. But yeah.
Out of interest, was Benson and Hedges like a personal sponsor of Damon Hill? Was that how he got in? Because I know they sponsored the Jordan team, but was it just that Damon Hill was a world champion and had a charming personality kind of thing? Was that how he did it?
Yeah, it's because he was a world champion, and of course, Benson and Hedges is gonna want a world champion in the team. They are sponsoring, so
yeah, they have been sponsoring Jordan since 1996. So that association existed before Hill came along. So
okay, fair enough. No, that's really interesting. I would just on the James Hunt and Niki Lauda, if I might reverse the conversation a little bit. Like, there are some things which happened in real life, which if they hadn't happened, we would never have had Rush, and never have had. I think the legacy would have been permanently changed. I think the joke I made after I saw Rush in the cinema with my brother is like, I can't wait for Rush 2, 1977, where Lauda just beats everybody. It's just like it'll be a very dull sequel. But I think what really would have killed the myth would have been if the first offer that Lauda got when he started snooping around for other drives from Ferrari was McLaren to join James Hunt in 1978. And it's like, imagine how much it really gets it kills the myth that they hated each other when they were literally considering being teammates. And it would have been interesting how that myth would have morphed, so to speak, with that sort of knowledge afterwards of how things would have changed in that universe.
Of course, go ahead.
And also James Hunt talked very highly of Lauda when he came back in 1982. So so that also killed the myth a little bit. Also, actually, a good Rush sequel would be based on the 1984 season. I think. Hunt can still make an appearance as a TV commentator, and then Lauda has this new younger teammate who's fast as hell. So that would make for an interesting sequel, maybe.
So what I wanted to point out was perhaps the myth would have become real if they had become teammates. We all know how it is sometimes with teammates, especially in a car that can actually challenge for the championship. McLaren only had that for like 1976 before they started dropping off before Ron Dennis came in, but that's neither here nor there. But the thing is, just take the most famous recent example, Hamilton and Rosberg, who were friends before they got together at Mercedes and now very much aren't friends for all we know. So perhaps the myth would have become a reality.
True. what else was interesting about the book? I liked how so much of it was written from his contemporaries. So there's a huge number of interviews with like Alan Prost, especially from the team managers, so like Max Mosley. One interesting parallel, we were talking about parallels with the modern day. It talks about how when he was at March, Ronnie Peterson was like 2 seconds a lap faster than him when they were doing testing. And he couldn't work out why. And it took him a couple of hours to realize that the car was terrible. And Lauda said so. It's like, this car is terrible. And then, of course, Robin Hurd and Max Mosley say, well, Ronnie Peterson's doing 2 seconds a lap faster than you. It can't be that bad. And he realized that Ronnie Peterson had a huge amount more natural talent as a driver than Lauda did. Bear in mind, this is 1972, before Lauda was like at his world championship sort of peak performance level. But he said that it taught him really to actually what Peterson was good at, in the same way that someone you might say like Fernando Alonso is good at, was getting around the problems of the car. And Lauda, the book kind of implicitly states that Lauda learned this at March, that actually it's one thing to be a fast driver, but it's also the one thing to develop your car to be exactly the way it should be. And obviously throughout Lauda's career, he was famously, he called the Ferrari a shitbox to Enzo Ferrari's face 100 times. And then the same at McLaren when they didn't have their turbo engine ready for 1984. And I find it interesting that we now have the same conversations about people like Fernando Alonso, where it's like he struggled at Ferrari to get a world championship and he never did earn one. And one of the big criticisms of Alonso is that he never developed the car to be a championship contender. He was always going around the problems that the car had to score great results. I don't know if there is another driver nowadays who you might say is a good car developer in the way that Lauda, for example, ended up becoming in the mid-70s.
Nowadays it's much more difficult because how big the teams are and how much the engineers work. So because of the teams are huge. I think the actual input of the driver towards development is I think it's somewhat lesser today. So I think
Because of course there's a lot of less testing.
and of course there's the lack of testing, which doesn't help either. Of course, you cannot take the things in simulator in the same way that you can do doing thousands of laps at random circuits around Europe. So as well or as good as a simulator works, it's never going to be the same. And I think of how again, because of how big the teams are, it's hard to say that we have the same kind of figure. Also because of the drivers nowadays are developed differently. They develop their careers develop, or their characters or abilities develop towards the requirement of what a modern driver should be. So because there's not the need for them to learn maybe these kind of skills of having a say about the car, how the car should be developed. Maybe we don't have that kind of character.
Yeah, please.
And of course, it should be noted that while that skill itself is not as important as it used to be, and partly just not as translatable, because modern Formula One cars are simply very complex machines to the point that up to a certain point, like you can as a driver obviously say, this is not working, this is oversteer, this is understeer, this is whatever the problem is. The thing is, obviously it can't quite work because you can't, unless you obviously have an aerodynamic engineering degree yourself, like say Sergei Sirotkin, you can't say, oh, this is not working because the airflow from the rear wing is bad because this part interacts with something that even the air engineers barely understand without the computer data behind it. But the thing is, one thing that I think drivers should be able to take from the Laudas and to a lesser extent the Schumacher era is that they need to have their team with them. As I have always been saying this, that you win races because of Ferrari, but win championships in spite of them. And this is something I feel Niki Lauda was the only driver who ever fully understood that. Whether he understood it just because the car was the infamous shitbox, or because he had a look at Ferrari's structure and thought, oh, Jesus Christ. It doesn't really matter. The thing is, and that is something Michael Schumacher did in a way by accident, because he just brought his entire Benetton guys with him to rebuild this championship team at Ferrari. But everyone else is always caught up in the mysticism. Oh, this is Ferrari. This is legends. This is history. When, yeah, Ferrari is Ferrari, for better and mostly worse, in terms of championship winning outfits. So it serves them, if they can't become development drivers in the sense of a Niki Lauda and the test drivers of yore, then they at the very least need to be like Lauda and be able to either put their guys in the structures or see the problem in the structure and lobby to have them fixed. So that's something they certainly can take from Lauda.
Two points I would say from that. One is that I grew an appreciation of Ayrton Senna when I did the profile on Alan Berg, the Canadian driver who was competing against Senna and Brundle in the 1983 British Formula 3 Championship. And one of the things that he said about Senna, and the reason why he was so damn good and so naturally talented, was because he was naturally point perfect on every single corner, every single lap. And the Allenberg nowadays is at Laguna Seca, and he has a little racing academy, and he helps test young drivers and stuff. And he said the difference between like a driver now in the year 2023 and when he was starting in 1983, 40 years ago, was that he would drive around in his car, and he would get out the car, and the engineer would chat to him. He'd go, all right, so what do you need? What's wrong? What needs to be improved? It's like, okay, well, I think we need to understeer or oversteer, whatever the problem is. Nowadays, a driver who's 15, 14, doesn't themselves know anything, gets out the car, and the engineer shows them, oh, here's your gigantic spreadsheet. This is which corners you need to attack more aggressively. This is, we can just see it automatically. And young drivers today get a huge amount more technical data and immediate feedback in the way that you didn't back in those days, which is how, so to speak, more naturally talented drivers were. Like, without going too much of a detour, I don't watch much in the way of feeder series, but I find feeder series are a great way of seeing good, talented young drivers, because there's a much greater performance gap between the best and the worst drivers in the way that you don't really get a huge amount in Formula One. Usually people are always debating who the best driver is in Formula One, because there's at least 3 or 4 who were basically at the peak level. But in junior series, it's much easier to see that. And I think in the old days, it was also much easier to see that because there was a lot more reliance on the natural talent of a driver.
Yeah, correct. Just to add a little something on that thing that you just said, Jeremy, is that you could actually see that on the last Grand Prix, on the Singapore Grand Prix, when Carlos Sainz was just talking to his engineer and said, "Okay, well, how fast can you go?" "Okay, yeah, I can do 1 second easy." So modern Formula One drivers just do what they need to do, and that's that. So they just manage what they have, and they manage the equipment, and if they need to be faster, they are immediately told, and they just go and try to do it.
No, exactly. It's an entirely different world of how racing is. It's so much more clinical, so to speak. I'm like, can you imagine saying to Ayrton Senna, "Oh, by the way, just do a second a lap faster on your lap"? He's like, I'm sure in those days the style of driving was so much more different, because they basically, their job was to go flat out all the time, and there probably was a lot less. I'm generalizing, of course, but there probably was a lot less in the way of IQ in each race, in terms of there was managing tires and there was managing fuel. But I'm sure nowadays it probably is, as you say, like, oh, do it a second lap faster so that when we do the pits, we'll end up in 7th rather than 12th when we come out. And those kind of strategies, which are so specific and so technically organized.
So, of course, this ties into the famous story of a race at, I think, was it Dallas or Detroit, where Ayrton Senna crashed, and he was like, No, I didn't crash because I screwed up. I crashed because the wall moved. And of course, everyone in Lotus thought he was having a screw loose. Turns out they had it measured, and turns out because earlier collisions, the barrier had actually moved by, what was it, 10 centimeters? So,
Yeah,
Ouch.
that was a Dallas. Yeah. So,
That's crazy. um, one more quick ramble is that you mentioned about Lauda getting on working with Ferrari. I would say one thing the book does really well is it explains how hyper punctual Lauda was as a person. And he was also, I think, from old money. He didn't get a huge amount of money himself from his family. Most of his family hated what he did and constantly discouraged him from doing it. But I think because he was part of that kind of society, I think he also knew implicitly how the game is played, which is a phrase I used earlier. But it talks about how he made friends with just about all of the Fiat and Ferrari head honchos. He went to see Enzo Ferrari every time he was in Maranello. He would always, after the test, drive to Ferrari's house and usually have dinner with him. And it's like he knew that that was what was required to really get through to them. Hey, look, you need to be developing for next year, or you need to be doing this, or this person needs to be put in charge. Actually being able to influence things not just on the track but off of it as well, especially in Ferrari. It goes on the book as well about how it didn't work at Jaguar, for example, where 20 years later F1 has become so corporatized that Niki Lauda was just like, oh, we need to hire this world champion because he's a good face for the company, sort of thing. But they didn't actually want to hear anything he had to say because he had nothing but horrible things to say about the Jaguar way of doing things. And
of course,
yeah,
nearly paid a near world champ, or they did pay a near world champion a lot of money. So it's neither here nor there.
Well, one funny thing is that he said that apparently Niki Lauda's favorite driver to work with was Eddie Irvine, and I thought that was quite funny when I heard that. But actually, when I think about it, they have quite similar personalities, and I think Eddie Irvine, while he wasn't the most talented driver in the world, he also had a brain on him about how to get things done and how to achieve what he wanted. I think a dumber driver would not have had 4 years in that Ferrari and become the third highest paid person in the Ford company, and then bought the entirety of Northern Ireland if they didn't have at least some personal sense. Like
yeah.
I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, Eddie Irvine was incredibly smart to do what he did. He just said, okay, I'm gonna be number 2 at Ferrari and just earn my money and get on with my job, and that's it. And that's what he did. And yeah, he made a good career out of it.
And he's also made a very large amount of money after his career in business investments. I always joke that Eddie Irvine is one of the few former Formula One drivers who could actually start a team like, say, Alan Prost did. The thing is just he has enough business sense to know not to.
Yeah. My comment earlier about buying Northern Ireland is that Eddie Irvine went into property development, so he bought half of Northern Ireland's property. So that's how he gets his income these days, and that's how he funds his yachts around Monaco.
But
And
of course, you can't tell the story on Niki Lauda without mentioning that one race, the 1976 German Grand Prix.
Yes, there is a lot in the book about it, and I was wondering how we could get into this subject. Everyone listening to this knows what we're talking about. Fascinating thing I found about the story is when John Watson's interviewed, he talks about how something I didn't know is that after the crash, after they pulled Lauda out of the burning wreckage, they had the paramedics came and everything, and Lauda was actually speaking. Lauda actually spoke. He was lying down. He was conscious. He was obviously in full, completely adrenaline shock sort of thing, but he actually spoke, and that's the reason why the race kept going, because all the drivers who came back were like, "Oh, he's okay. He's burned. He's injured, but he's alive and he's okay." And that the actual real injury had been invisible. It had been the injuries in his lungs, which were killing him, which almost did kill him literally that evening. I thought that was quite interesting. But I think the reason why we brought this up is so we could move on to our next subject, and I guess I'll segue it by mentioning what we haven't spoken about very much, which is the 1980s era of Niki Lauda.
Yeah,
So Lauda,
because
yeah, please.
oh, sorry, I keep interrupting you. No, you can go ahead.
No, okay. I was just going to say that Lauda retired for 2 years. He basically went on a hiatus after falling out with F1 in general, and then kind of got the bug and came back with McLaren. And he was a very honest and very blunt person. And as a result, when he was teamed up with Alain Prost, who had left Renault in the end of 1983, was used to the turbo engines and was just a very quick driver in general. Lauda had a lot of, and not internal conflict. That's a bit of a dramatic way of putting it, but he sort of internalized that Prost was a better natural driver than he was, and I think it was I think it's like an implicit thing that Morris Hamilton, the author, has done, in that it kind of comes full circle. At the end of Lauda's career, he was using his noose, so to speak, to beat Prost at the 1984 championship, in spite of the fact that Prost was faster. He got poles, he won more races, but Lauda knew how to get the car perfect to his liking and get it to a third place, get it to a second place, even if he didn't win. Because at the end of his career, he was not as fast as he was in the late 70s. And I this was a subject which we briefly brought up with Felipe Massa a few podcasts ago, but I think we can segue now, unless did you have some closing words about Lauda yourself, Leonard?
Well, not really. The thing with Prost and Lauda, that reminds me of a time where I watched the Austrian Grand Prix of Lauda's championship season, where Prost spun out ahead of Lauda, and James Hunt went on to criticize Prost for being unreliable, which of course history would prove to be very ironic. But yeah, and just generally speaking, that it is very amazing that despite the horrifying accident and the consequences thereof, Lauda managed to not only win a championship again, but win 2 championships again. That is the fascinating thing. The majority of his world titles are after he got burned to a crisp, but he gets it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating story.
Yeah, talking about that Austrian Grand Prix of 1984, actually, Prost spun out of the race because of an oil spill by Leo De Angelis Lotus, who Piquet managed to spot and avoid, but Prost, who was running just behind, couldn't see and react to in time. So yeah, that's why and how that happened.
But again, Hunt went in on him, on the commentary, like that. It wasn't even. I was very much lessening the blow, so to speak, when I gave his word. But he was very rough on Prost in terms of his youth and inexperience. Again, history proved that to be a very ironic comment. But
it's lovely and implicit, because Prost ended up becoming the most reliable driver at finishing, and he scored more points than Ayrton Senna at McLaren, and for that similar reason, whereby it's like after 2 races into 1989, Prost was winning the championship despite the fact that he hadn't won any races. It was because he came second all those times, and it's like it was that ability to really work the car to perfection, even when you weren't the fastest driver necessarily, and that's what Lauda was able to do and win his 3rd championship. Before we jump over, I just wanted to say that, like, Niki Lauda he was also a very funny man, and he, from what I understood of all the interviews in the book, and Daniel can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the thing he had the biggest regret in Niki Lauda's career was inviting Ron Dennis to his retirement speech. Ron Dennis had insisted, when Lauda had told him he was retiring, that he come along and be there beside him in the press conference, wherever it was in America, to announce that he was retiring. Lauda did so. He announced, "This is my last year. These are my last few races." And then apparently Ron Dennis completely hijacked the press conference and talked about how, but actually, really, the credit should be going to John Barnard for building such a fantastic car, which Lauda has driven to a couple of 3rd places this year. Was basically what he said. Yeah, it's funny how Lauda.
That's probably the most Ron Dennis conference of all time.
And it's like, I like how Niki Lauda's biggest regret in his career, or his biggest like the thing he looks back on as the thing he hated the most was not the fact that he almost died in a burning crash. It was Ron Dennis coming to his retirement speech. I thought that was wonderful, and it's something that people have said before as well. It's like for someone with the reputation that Ron Dennis has, in terms of his success, it's like I don't know anyone who actually likes him or has anything nice to say about him.
If I recall, Mika Häkkinen is kind of nice to him, but given as he was the favorite son of Ron, yeah, that is not worth that much.
Yeah, I think.
With all due respect to Mika, I love him.
Yeah, I think Ron tended very much to favor one of his drivers and then just go with it, and that's how he operated his team. So yeah, first, when Lauda came into the team, it was Lauda, then it was Prost, then Senna, then Hakkinen afterwards. Very much, and then Lewis Hamilton.
Famously Hamilton as well, of course. So,
Yeah.
Lennart, do you want to segue us into our next subject? I think I have exhausted not all of my interesting points about Niki Lauda, but I'll be here for another hour if I'm giving you all the other ones. I'm going to write a book review of it for the website, which might come out around about the same time as this podcast does, which you can read about.
I am very much looking forward to reading it myself. But obviously, when we talk about drivers who come back from injury, Niki Lauda is the man on that. As I said, more world titles won after nearly dying than before. The same, interestingly, goes to a lesser point for Michael Schumacher. But the point that brought this topic up was a discussion in the GPR Discord, link in the description, that Lance Stroll in the current year of 2023 is struggling a lot, and some speculate it's not because he's bad, which he kind of isn't, but it's because he had a nasty injury before the start of the season and he hasn't fully recovered from it. And that leads to the entire general second major point of our podcast is injuries, usually sustained in crashes in terms of racing drivers. How do they affect drivers? Do they affect drivers at all? And what separates those that are negatively affected from those that aren't? And Daniel, I think you have a couple of names to mention in that discussion, don't you?
Yeah, I have a few. First, I would like to make a point about Lance Stroll. I'm gonna deviate immediately after getting the question. But sorry about this. But yeah, I don't think Lance Stroll season is being highly influenced by that accident directly. I mean, at least in a physical way. I think it's more a character like Fernando Alonso arriving to the team and basically building the team around him, which is what most of the champions do. So I think it's more basically it's more around it's more because of that than than anything that happened in that accident and its possible physical repercussions. This said, going back into your question, Lennart. I think we were mentioning Olivier Panis, for example, just before we started this podcast, and Olivier Panis is a very interesting case to see what happened to him in the 1997 Canadian Grand Prix, when basically he was having the best season of his life and then broke both legs, and then he seemed to never be the same driver afterwards, and so I think it largely depends on the type of injury rather than the fact of having an injury. Some accidents can become very nasty, especially if anything regarding the head of the driver is involved. Point in case Carl Bendinger. So
He's a very good example of that.
yeah, Carl Bellinger or someone. I would say someone like who didn't suffer such a big injuries from accident, but actually Ivan Capelli, who crashed in the Canadian Grand Prix in 1992 in the Ferrari. Of course, it was a terrible Ferrari, and he was already having a terrible season by that point. But he seemed to whack his head quite badly in that accident, and of course, back then the repercussions of head injuries weren't as understood as they are today, and he never seemed to fully recover after that.
Well, he retired the following year, didn't he? After he did a few races for Jordan, I think.
Yeah, he lost all motivation, I think, after what happened at Ferrari. But I think that accident also, in some way, affected him. So yeah, I think that the type of injury is a very important factor here because I don't think, for instance, giving my opinion on Panis, I don't think Panis was a worse driver afterwards than he was before his accident. The car was just worse. Prost in 1997, when Panis came back, the Prost had lost its edge that it had from the beginning of the season because the car never developed as well as the other teams did, and then there weren't many races towards the end of the season where the Bridgestones were the tires to have. Maybe Jerez, but that was when Damon Hill made out most of the Bridgestones in qualifying for that race. And then the following year, the Prost was a disaster. So, but Paris did well against that young driver like Jarno truly was at the moment. So I don't think the accident affected Panis that badly. Also, similar type of injury, Michael Schumacher, of course, when he came back, actually he was
5 titles in a row.
Yeah, 5 titles in a row. That says it all. So it depends on the type of injury very much.
Yeah, it's tying into the Panis discussion, of course, especially we look back at the early 1997 results, and obviously we think, oh, what a missed opportunity this season turned out to be. But the thing is, we have to remember that assessing a car's performance always is a bit of a contextual thing. When we're talking about how good is a car, we can obviously look at it perform, but we also need to remember who drives it. Like, the thing is, we have to remember who was his teammate in 1997 before the injury. It was Shinji Nakano, who I wish to remind the listener is a very much a GP reject. And that ties into the whole story of Olivier Panis, that there is a tendency to somewhat overrate who he was before the accident simply because he mostly beat the crap out of pay drivers and other drivers of lower quality, without wishing to insult those drivers, but I kind of did. But if we're looking at, there was Nakano before, the year before that, his teammate was Pedro Diniz. His teammates the years before that were, with one exception, also very much in the pay driver galore. There were Gori Suzuki, there was Johnny Herbert for like one race. Okay, he wasn't a pay driver. And there was Eric Bernard. The only non-pay driving teammate he had before Trulli arrived on the scene was Martin Brundle, and Martin Brundle had him 8-3 in qualifying battle. So it was one of those things where the thing that often happens with dead drivers, in the sense that, oh, they would have gone on to great things, which I myself am guilty of. Keyword Drew Bianchi. But that thing I think happened a lot with Pan, is that people looked at his post-injury career where he was a tolerable, very good, reliable driver that got results, but also didn't blow the roof off, and just thought, oh, what he could have been, when that was all he ever could have been, injury or not.
I think a lot of it is also like potential as well. It's when potential isn't fulfilled and someone has had a very heavy injury, it's very easy to point at the injury and say, okay, as you say with Jules Bianchi, it's like there was a huge amount of potential from Jules Bianchi which wasn't fulfilled. If I may, I actually don't know anything about the Carl Wendlinger crash. Like, what was Carl Wendlinger like before, and what kind of potential do we think he had as a driver?
So I think Berlinger, well, of course he's known for his sports car exploits with Sauber, together with Schumacher and Frentzen. So he was actually, I would say, somewhere in between those two, maybe, or somewhere around Frenzen's league. So very very competent, maybe midfield driver, I would say, up to the point of the accident. Actually, he already got some points to his name in 1994 in the Sauber.
Yeah, he had a fourth and at San Marino and a sixth at Brazil. Didn't finish in Aida, but
Yeah, those were very good results because according to Frentzen, the 1994 Sauber at the beginning of the season was a little bit of a disaster, and it went.
Frentzen himself only had a fifth in Aida and didn't finish in Brazil and only finished seventh in San Marino. He would know what he's talking about.
Yeah, so that car improved a lot towards the end of that season. And yeah, Wellinger would have or could have probably taken a podium or two out of it. So I don't know. I don't know if he would have been in the same league as say Barrichello was in that season, but yeah, he was doing good. I tend to put actually connecting this with Panis. I tend to put all these 90s, mid 90s drivers, Barrichello, sort of Panis, friends, and Benlinger, so some in some sort of the same league of driver, like very competent midfielders who, with a good car, could win races, but they were never going to be championship winning material. So yeah, I think Benlinger was that some that he was in that league of driver, I would say.
Yeah, after the accident, he just never was the same. Sauber tried to get him back into the car. It turned out to be a catastrophe. He did end up being a somewhat good. He ended up being a FIA GT champion, so that's that. But we're talking still GT2, GT1 cars here, so there's an whole other level. Like he also had a DTM, very short-lived DTM career where he really wasn't good. Then when the GT1 World Championship actually became a thing, he also was absolutely middle of the pack. So yeah, that was a case where it was very clear. Yeah, this man is not the same who he was before.
Yeah, Bellinger's 1993 teammate JJ Leto actually also I think coming back too early from his accident. Was it a testing? No, was it the Imola accident? It was a testing accident actually, the one that knocked him up. Yeah, but yeah, coming too early from his accident. Actually, that's what he killed his Formula One career when it was starting to improve, and so that was another driver. Yeah, sadly lost to a bad recovery from an accident, or in this case, rather coming back too early from an accident.
Yeah, that seems to be a very key issue. Like we also mentioned Ivan Capelli, and like Wendlinger, Capelli never really had a post Formula One career. Like he appeared every now and then for a race, and he had like one or two touring car seasons after that. But it was something, he was more or less finished after the Jordan experiment. So I think that is actually a very important point to mention, that drivers who take their time recovering tend to perform better afterwards. Though, of course, as with everything, there are exceptions. Like Niki Lauda, very infamously, to come back to him, very infamously came back very early while his wounds were still not fully healed.
Yeah, actually the book makes an excellent. Who was it? I can't remember who made this quote, but someone mentioned the book, right? They thought Lauda came back actually too early, and if he had waited just a tiny little bit, he might have been a champion that year instead of coming at Monza. Monza was too early.
Of
Yeah,
course,
that theory is raised. I don't remember who raised it, but it is raised.
so of course, that ties in a way back to our earlier point that Lauda never was the most talented guy out there, but a very cranial one. And obviously, he didn't suffer brain damage, even though he had the damaged lungs. Obviously, that part didn't go away, and so obviously we also have to question then how much does it play whether you are a cranial driver or whether you are a driver who bases his success of talent. Like, say, for example, if Kimi Raikkonen had picked up a major injury, or if Jenson Button had picked up a major injury, how would they have recovered? But obviously, that is a very morbid hypothetical, so I can understand if you don't want to engage with it. So.
But we don't need to make a hypothetical, though, because I think Nelson Piquet is a good example, because it's understood that after his crash in San Marino in 1987, another driver who won a championship after a serious injury, he said that his perception was buggered basically after that, and he was driving at basically 90% at his best after that. And you'll also notice, if you look at Piquet's career following that accident, that just about every win, if not every win, Piquet took following his accident in 87 was inherited, so to speak. That people in front of him had crashed out. If famously Nigel Mansell waving to the crowd and all that. Like most of his wins towards the end of his career were all inherited, and so he had the speed to keep his car in second, but he didn't have that final X factor which could launch him into the lead with an incredible overtake.
Yeah, but I would argue as well that the Benetton didn't have the 1990 and 1991 Benetton didn't
Sure.
have that extra speed to launch into the lead anyways. So just
Sure.
I would agree that
that's a
Piquet
fair point.
just was where he needed to be at that moment to win those races.
But there is a quality to always being there at the right time. It's something that Lewis Hamilton has. If someone else screws up, Lewis Hamilton is almost always there, inexplicably getting a podium, even if he spent the whole race in 8th. And I think that's a quality Piquet had, of always getting the car to the finish, even when he himself was not at his best. Yeah, I don't know if that's like a too much of a stretch to say so, but I that's what I would say at least.
Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, but it's curious that someone like Piquet recovered from that type of injury, and then we have other people like Felipe Massa saying that he basically never lost the speed, so he felt actually the same. But that's probably down to modern medicine being better, basically, and having a much deeper understanding of that type of injury and how to recover from it and what's needed to recover from that type of injury. Also we could go back to Fernando Alonso with the testing crash in the McLaren. He apparently suffered a concussion, but then then he came back and his speed was the same afterwards. So,
and then of course we tie into the general notion of a driver aging, because the thing is, we are also another example for that would be Ralf Schumacher, who had major testing accident even before his thing in Indianapolis in 2004. He had a crash in 2003 where he missed the Italian Grand Prix, was it not? And after that, he also was slower, but again, he was also beginning to phase out of the phase where he had that world championship level speed and became just well, in American football, they call a quarterback who isn't great but does his job the game manager. So you could call this type of driver race manager, where they do what Nelson Piquet's thing, where he wasn't actually the fastest guy on track, but he was there to pick up the pieces and basically drives the car as good as it is, no better, no worse. And with that type of race manager, which obviously some drivers become as they become older, like Felipe Massa, when he returned in 2010, that was his 7th or 8th season. I am not actually sure which one of the two it is, but it is one of the two.
Uh-huh.
So obviously that is the point where some drivers start to not slow down, but become more long-term focused. And of course, it didn't help for Massa that, oh, you've recovered from your injury. That's great. Now you have to face arguably one of the greatest drivers of your generation. Have fun with that as a teammate.
Yeah. One interesting thing about Massa saying that he himself would say that he'd never slowed down. He and Lauda both said the same thing. I think Lauda basically said that he had no actual long-term problems from it. I think the reason perhaps is because both of them they both blacked out the incident. Like Felipe Massa has no memory of the incident ever happening, which may also be a positive factor in the fact that because he doesn't remember it, he has no trauma from it, so to speak. He has amnesia, but he had no actual racing trauma.
Yeah, of course, it's all different types of injuries and accidents and consequences, physical consequences for the driver. Yeah, but it's funny. It's funny because, for example, we have another example of a terrible accident in Gerhard Berger, also at Tamburello, like Piquet. And Gerhard has full recollection of that accident. He can explain it in great detail until the moment of the crash, of course. And then actually he recovered, but yeah, and I would argue he was as fast as before. Maybe not as fearless on track as before the accident, but surely the speed was still there. Actually, I've been studying the 1989 season recently, doing some numbers on gaps between drivers and stuff, and basically Berger just took 2-3 races to be at Mansell's speed again. So at least in qualifying and sometimes during the race as well. So yeah, he recovered, I would say, pretty fast from that one, considering how terrifying that accident was.
So I fear we come up with the conclusion that there is really no unifying factor as to what makes an accident recoverable for a driver and what not. So sorry if you were hoping for a great solution to the question of how to best handle an accident. So sorry, young drivers, you're on your own on that one.
Was this a question that our listeners were asking? Without going too much into endless examples, there is one I would love to hear your opinions of if you know anything about it. Johnny Herbert is usually credited as being at his best before he ever got to Formula One. Commentators, at least in the British press, say that Johnny Herbert was the next big thing to come out of British racing. And Johnny Herbert won 3 races, but let's say all 3 of them were of the inherited kind. Like he didn't zoom his way to the lead. He inherited it usually when Schumacher was getting punted off by Damon Hill. But Herbert was still a pretty good driver. I mean, I think any team would have been more than, like, they would have benefited from having Herbert driving in just about any of the years Herbert drove. But there's always that lingering thing over his career whereby he was, it's often said that he was never the same driver after his crash in, I think it was in Formula 3000 or British Formula 3 in the late 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys know anything about that.
Yeah. Well, I have an opinion on it. I don't know if it's gonna be very popular, but yeah, my opinion is, yeah, of course, Herbert was very handicapped in his career because of that accident, especially in the early years. He basically couldn't apply as much force to the brakes as he would have needed to essentially be faster, and that can be seen especially in 1989 when he makes his debut for Benetton, and then he scores a fantastic 4th place in Brazil in his debut. but then he goes to San Marino and he's basically nowhere, and that's because in Brazil he could basically go around that problem because he didn't have any because the old Japarekawa Jakap
The Rio circuit.
the Rio yeah exactly, the Rio.
I never know how to pronounce it either.
Rio didn't have any heavy braking zones. So the moment Herbert arrives at San Marino and needs to brake at Tosa, for example, he's nowhere because he cannot apply enough force to the brakes. And of course, he didn't get the results for Benetton, and then he was substitute for Emanuele Pirro for that season, and then he came. He needed basically the whole of 1990 to recover, racing elsewhere, but also recovering at the same time. And he was much prepared when he came back in 1991. And he was affected by but also you have to ask yourself if Johnny played the political game well, because of course when he came back to Benetton, he of course one can feel for him and say he was mistreated with all the politics going around, not being able to see Schumacher's telemetry and all that kind of stuff that went on. But as well, he had a winning car, and he raced there just one season and then left the team. And because he wasn't getting along well with Briatore, basically. So of course, Johnny Herbert was a fantastic driver in Formula 3000 and was super talented, and it's a great case of what might have been. But I don't think that other aspects that need to be there in order to become a world champion were there. So maybe the speed was there, but other aspects I don't know if they were there. Another great case is, well, I'd let Lennart have his say on Herbert, and then go back to another great example of a British driver whose career might have suffered.
Yeah, the thing with Herbert for me is we have to remember when his crash happened, there was an actual chance of them needing to amputate the leg. That was a fact. And that very much reminds me of, because everyone loves cross-sport comparisons, the case of Sean Livingston, who is an NBA player, or was an NBA player, he's retired by now, who had one of the most gruesome injuries in the history of basketball in 2006. Was it 2005, 2006? Doesn't matter. And there was also the thing that nearly his leg needed to amputate. Those who do not have seen the video, don't YouTube it. I am dead serious on that one. The thing is, after that, he slowly worked his way back with the small contracts with teams that were desperate to take a flyer, and eventually he ended up being a great role player for the Golden State Warriors dynasty that won 3 championships while he was there. And I feel in many ways that is comparable to Herbert in the sense that, we always have the question of what Herbert could have been, but what he became is still good enough in a way. Like, Herbert is a multiple-time race winner, even if the wins were inherited by Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher doing stupid things.
And David Coulthard.
And David Coulthard, of course. But the thing is, to finish first you have to finish, as the saying goes. And as tying back to Lauda knew, and we all saw what it got him. So in a way, it's not so much where you have the Capelli thing or the Wendlinger thing, where you were always left with wondering what could have been, but you saw a guy who had a couple of wins, who was a long time paid to drive Formula One, who, if I recall correctly, also had a couple of not so bad races in kart, but that is not my kart expertise at the time. And in the end, this is something where I feel in many ways the perception differs because you don't have this inherent notion that he was robbed of potential, because in the end he got something good out of Formula One and out of the sport, and that is where the Livingston comparison ties in, because he also got great things out of the sport. Even if we have this question of what if, we never have this question of what if being the only thing about that driver.
No, that's well put. I guess the only thing I would say would be missing from Herbert's career was the fact that I think Daniel was alluding to it, but it was Herbert's choice not to join Ferrari with Schumacher at Ferrari. Herbert was Schumacher's first choice as teammate, and Herbert said no because he didn't want to be. He basically didn't want to be number two, and that was his personal choice, and it would have been interesting. An alternate reality with Herbert instead of Irvine is in the second Ferrari over those, at least in the first 2 years, for example, 96 and 97. How he would have done.
The influence of that is how most interesting to me what it would affect at Stewart, because obviously Herbert had 1999 a Euro, and would he been there for that? So that is the one that would have me the most interesting in the Herbert to Ferrari hypothetical.
Yeah, that's an interesting what if. The other driver I was I that came to my mind during this conversation is Martin Brundle, because he had a horrible accident in Dallas in 1984 where he injured his legs. Basically his career was never the same afterwards. He couldn't drive as fast because of the limitations derived from that accident.
So, and we did end up with something to advise young drivers after all. Make sure you don't have any lasting injuries after your accident, because you're totally in control of that, aren't you?
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, don't crash against a concrete wall. That's our advice to young drivers everywhere.
I've actually never heard of the Brundle crash.
Yeah, look out for it. It's in Dallas '84. He suffered a terrible accident with the T-rail.
I actually knew he crashed, but I didn't remember, or let's just say I didn't know it actually took that much of a toll on him. But, well, to be fair to Brundle, say whatever else you want about the man, but he has never made excuses, as far as I know, in his life for how his things turned out for him. So.
No, especially given as much as he is in the in the public sphere of Formula One. I think if he had been loud about it, we probably would have heard about it. At least I probably would have heard about it by now.
I mean, same here. While I obviously, when I watched the race live, I watched them with German commentary. Eventually, you end up with Brundle commentary whenever we watch something, because, English torrents are obviously I would never imply that I download races in torrents. I have an entire tape collection. No illegal downloads here. No siree.
Yeah, there's. I don't know if there's footage of the accident itself, but there's certainly pictures, and you can see how the whole front of the Tyrrell is destroyed, basically. And that must have taken. Let's say, to put it mildly, Brundle's legs must have taken a good whack at that crash.
Okay. Oh, where to next? Where do we go from here?
Well, crashing leads to a certain, or at the very least it leads my mind, because it's completely poisoned by this movie, to a certain motorsport movie that everyone hates, loves, or nowadays mostly doesn't care about.
I absolutely hate it, but I'm on the hate. I'm on the hater side.
Sylvester Stallone's motorsport masterpiece, Driven. Whether masterpiece has a sarcastic, actually no, there's no discussion. The masterpiece has sarcastic quotation marks on them.
Okay, we can just put it in the so bad it's good category of movies.
I've watched it 3 times. The second 2 times were against my will. But I will say that the third time I watched it, when I was with a group of like 10 people, all of whom it was this international summit we recently had where some of the GP Rejects people came together, which Daniel and I personally met at. That was when we watched it against my will for the third time. I watched it, and it was it's funnier when you can just accept it for being absolute rubbish. But but the reason why we're bringing this movie up out of the blue, with the world's worst segue, is that we watched this at the International Summit, and it got me thinking about Driven itself. So, for those of you who don't know, Driven is a masterpiece film. It's starring Sylvester Stallone, and it was originally supposed to be based off of an beginning of the 2000s Formula One season. Rennie Harlin, the Finnish director, came in and wanted to make basically a movie about motorsport and the excitement and make up this fictional story. Bernie Eccleston, wisely, because I probably didn't need the money that much, told him to get lost. Rennie Harlin, that is, and Harlin instead went to kart during the IndyCar kart split and made it with kart cars and that season.
It should be noted that Bernie Ecclestone had the wisdom to do that, but Liberty Media do not, as a new Formula One film is in production, starring Brad Pitt.
That's true.
That's gonna be a fascinating watch one way or another.
Yeah, we have to do some sort of commentary track of that. It's just for note. Although this might date the podcast a little bit, this upcoming movie with Brad Pitt is apparently Brad Pitt is a driver who has been out of Formula One for 30 years, who is coming back in to show the young drivers a lesson, which would effectively make him Michael Andretti, which in any timeline would just be. Well, I think Formula One definitely needs to see Michael Andretti come back.
Absolutely. Yes.
We kind of actually have to, now that you mentioned Michael Andretti, we have forgotten the quintessential name in reject lore in terms of crashes and the coming back thereof. Alessandro Zanardi.
Of course.
How in the name of the racing gods did we forget about Zanardi?
And Zanardi also cameos in Driven, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed he does. I think in one press conference scene, and of course in the great final pre-race scene where the drivers all prepare for the last dance of the season. And that scene is awesome. I will fight anyone who says it isn't awesome.
No, it's very cool. But no, you're right. Should we backtrack? So yeah, Alessandro Zanardi.
Well,
what
can we say about Zanardi outside that he is great and an inspiration for everyone?
Yeah, but let's stick with nonsense like Driven. We had two ideas we wanted to bring up, but I wasn't sure which one would you prefer. When we had a one or two drinks inside of us, we had this idea of what would a Driven movie be like if it was made today. So either as a sequel or as a standalone first movie.
Oh, a remake! I love that.
Remake, because there's no other fresh IPs left which haven't been remade. We're now remaking Driven. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's do that. Let's remake Driven. What would you have as a Driven remake? How would you set it in the year 2023?
Obviously, since Card regrettably does not exist anymore, we still assume Formula One is intelligent enough to tell us to sod off, or at the very least, Brad Pitt will be like, no, we don't have two Formula One movies. Even though, interestingly, we are currently in a mini golden age of racing movies, as the Gran Turismo movie is either set to release or already has released by the time this podcast goes online, but that's neither here nor there.
It's been out for months, Lennart. It came out like 2 months ago.
I am very slow and very much not in tune with Hollywood. Anyway, obviously, since Card is out and Formula One doesn't want Driven Reloaded either, we have to go with the one series that would be extreme enough and wild enough to go along with that idea. And that series is obviously none other than the great Formula E.
I thought you were about to say Extreme E.
That is too extreme. We could not show that in cinemas. Heads would explode, like in that one famous clip where everyone's heads explodes. You know the one.
Yeah, of course.
The Simpsons, yeah.
Yeah, of course. It could have been called something like.
It would be too extreme.
it would be
So we
called
do that.
something Driven Enlightened or something like this.
Yeah.
No, those things always have a subtitle with an RE beginning. Revolutions, Revelations.
I was going to say
Reloaded.
Resurrections, but that
Resurrections,
might be a bit grim.
brilliant.
That might be a bit grim.
Recharged.
Yeah,
Recharged.
Recharge is
Formula
perfect.
E, perfect. Recharge. Grim Recharge.
So we had this. Well, drunkenly, I have my notes here. Thankfully, typed up rather than written up. Basically, it's how. So for those of you who don't know the plot of the original Driven film, basically Sylvester Stallone's character Joe Tanto is an old driver who hasn't driven for many years, and he's brought out of retirement to help Jimmy Bly, who's this rookie young driver who resembles in personality and looks Jacques Villeneuve, which I'm sure is a total coincidence. But Jimmy Bly is like, he's young, he's fast, but he's also like, because he's young, he's got all these distractions, and Joe Tanto's job is to set him right and get him to win the championship. There's a bunch of other stuff in there, but there are lots of points made in the film about how dangerous motor racing is, which are then also sort of, well, completely negated by some of the reckless driving done by the main characters in the
And of
middle
course,
of the film. But
my personal negative favorite thing about Driven is the crashes, where if you look at the footage of the cars they actually recorded, it's very clear that, this car was not that fast. Like, there's a scene in the final race where the footage of the car shown that they recorded at the actual kart races is at a 90-degree corner, so the classic street circuit corner. Everyone knows what I mean. And you see the cars going through there at, I don't know, 130, 140 kilometers per hour. And then, this car flips 3 times. I dare every listener who has access to a video game, to a racing video game, to take a Formula car, Formula 1 car, who doesn't matter. Take a circuit with a 90-degree corner, say Baku. Drive that corner, and then try to flip your car 2 or 3 times. If you can do it, I won't give you money because I don't want to give you money.
you can email us at Grand Prix Rejects.
I will be very impressed, and I will shout out whatever you want me to shout out to next time we do a podcast. I guarantee you that. That is a promise.
I would say that once I flipped a beach buggy at around 15 kilometers per hour. So
in real life or in a video game?
In real life, yeah, this happened in real life.
Yeah.
I still have some photos of the crash. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to say, well, firstly, to address your point about crashing overly fast cars, because bear in mind, much of the footage in Driven is sped up. One thing they can do in Formula E is the cars aren't fast enough, so there's no need to speed up the footage or have cars doing ridiculous speeds because they're too slow anyway to do so.
And as the real Formula E shows, you do not need high speeds to avoid ridiculous crashes because, as we all know, Formula E has enough of those.
That's true as well. So we have a couple of ideas that we threw about as to who would Joe Tanto be? Who would be the old driver who just walks into Formula E in this case? An old American driver, Scott Speed. So we would have a Scott Speed character who just jumps right into Formula E and is immediately up to speed and almost wins his first race.
This is something I actually was looking forward to the most because there are 2 drivers in the Formula E history who are old, who were old at the time they arrived, and who have a very movie-fitting personality. The one is Jacques Villeneuve, who actually showed up for, was it 2 or 3 races? I don't even remember. It wasn't very many. And obviously, you don't need to say much about Jacques Villeneuve, what he's like. We all know that. He's a very entertaining person, especially with his opinion on motorsports nowadays. And I would never say that he's an out-of-touch old man who complains about the modern state of affairs, because that would be destroying a lot of glass houses by throwing stones.
Please go on.
But the The second one, the name that is actually more interesting, especially in the movie contest, is Felipe Massa, who also drove Formula E, if you will remember.
Oh, that's
And
true.
given recent events in real life, this would be obviously something that would be very interesting to fit in the movie, in the sense that he's this guy who feels or who was robbed in the past by something cruel and something scandalous, and then there'll be the big scene where near the end where in the actual movie the team boss, the Sir Frank Williams XB, played by the late great Burt Reynolds, says, I'm not extending that kid because he doesn't have it. And in the recharged remake, he was like, I'm not resigning that kid, he doesn't have it. And I'm not resigning you either. And then he'd be like, you owe me. I didn't rat you out when you screwed me out of the championship back then. Or something
Oh,
like that.
so you would have the team boss basically a Flavio Briatore character, some sort of
Something
mishmash
along
of.
those lines. Because
Ah,
the thing is, in many ways, I don't think the Sir Frank Williams character would work for a modern movie because,
no.
quite frankly, the harsh, ruthless boss, most of us have that in our daily lives, and we are now so conditioned to accept that, oh, he's harsh to his employees. Well, that's normal for a boss, isn't it? So, but that's just me being cynical about the working life.
Well, then if we have the Flavio Briatore type of team boss, then we definitely need Nelson Piquet Jr., of course.
Is he a
Yes,
Moreno character?
even great. That's even better because he's, well, he wasn't old by the time he got to Formula E, but he did have a career to look back on. He could, and obviously movies can just take liberties and make the Piquet Jr. simply older. So that would actually be a very interesting thing in the sense not that he has this adversary relationship because he was screwed out of him, but he was his accomplice in crime, and unlike the real Piquet, he didn't rat him out. Or the conflict could be that he did rat him out, and now the Briatore didn't go to the Tanto in quotation marks because he's the old guy who got it. But in the sense of, oh god, I have no other option than to call him. We could even have this dreadful joke, dread moment thing where he's like, we gotta call him. Oh no. Then cut to the Piquet Junior XP doing what he does to some silly soundtrack like Bad to the Bone. Bad to the Bone.
Is that is that the end of the? It just okay. I see. I had a very different idea of what the team boss situation would be. My idea was instead of a Nelson Piquet Flavio Briatore relationship, because in the original Driven, Jacques Villeneuve's character has a brother who is also his like boss, his manager sort of thing, and they're the ones who have the conflict about. They have various conflicts in the movie, but
Played by the actor who would go on to be Dr. Wilson in the famous TV series House. So that's the TV nerdy thing for the day. I don't know why I mentioned that, but I wanted to mention it.
And thank you for mentioning it. I wanted to say that the other interesting dynamic, which could potentially work, would be a father-son dynamic in terms of having an input Lance Stroll, Lawrence Stroll situation.
Oh, that's a good one.
I don't know how many people are at this team, but so I'm not sure how it would be. But maybe the main character is Lance Stroll, and so Jacques Villeneuve is now Lance Stroll, and his dad runs the team, and it's his dad who is the person who's like embodying the Frank Williams and the brother character in one.
Okay, easy in this universe. Gilles Villeneuve never died, so there you have it.
No. Jacques Villeneuve is the No. Jacques Villeneuve was the personality of Jimmy Bly, but in this movie, it would be a Lance Stroll with the personality of Jacques Villeneuve, but his dad is Lawrence Stroll.
All right, I got it.
That's not confusing. And his new teammate would be, who did we agree upon? No, his new teammate would be Jacques Villeneuve, but his old teammate, the Memo Moreno character, who would maybe somehow still be their teammate, I don't really understand how it actually worked in Driven in the first place.
It worked like this. Memo was the original teammate, but because he didn't prove enough of a mentor, team player, whatever, he gets kicked out for Tanto. And then after Bly screws the pooch in, where was it? Where did he screw the pooch? Not in Germany. The race before that. No, after Bly did the whole I'm driving around the city thing because my girl that was never my girl to begin with went back to her fiance.
That's true.
After
Yes.
that, Burt Reynolds said, "Yeah, Tando, you suck as a mentor. I'm putting Memo back in." And then Memo went into business for himself and wanted to be the guy taking the lead and crashed himself nearly to death. So, good job, Burt Reynolds.
So my point was that we need to have a comic relief, happy-go-lucky character the way Memo Moreno was. So I had this crazy idea that Memo Moreno would now be a happy Australian character who drinks alcohol out of his shoe.
I like the idea, but I have to say ew out of principle because shoes are disgusting.
I feel like that would be a great, because especially in the original Driven, because it had that horrible, very dated style of like flashing zoom-ins on things happening, and you could have like the race. The movie begins with like the aftermath of a race, and it's showing all the glitz and glamour, and it just zooms in on this Memo Moreno character who's a happy Australian just chugging champagne out of his shoe. It would be a fantastic opening shot for the movie.
Yeah, especially in contrast with the new Jimmy Bly being still subject to the same pressures and that is something I actually want to stress, that the movie actually was in one specific way rather progressive in that it performed sexual harassment on a male as very uncomfortable for the man in question. So obviously I would insist the recharge version keeps that one because again it's rare enough for that to be acknowledged. Soapbox. I'm soapboxing.
No. The other option is that we can also merge the Strolls with the Verstappens. So the kid who comes on and is the Wunderkind is Max Verstappen, and his dad is Jos Verstappen, who's also the team owner.
Who totally isn't abusive.
No, I get a Lawrence Stroll, Jos Verstappen, Frank Williams hybrid monster team boss. Poor kid. One more thing I had in my two more things, but I'll do one at a time. The other one was that the Driven movie makes a big point about driver safety, and there's this tragic scene at the end where Memo Moreno crashes and his car launches 7 kilometers outside of the circuit, and the only person who can get to them is Joe Tanto, who has to jump off the pit wall, jump into his car, drive across the street, or drive into the lake or whatever. And it's this whole thing about drivers helping each other, making sure that this is too dangerous to drive.
Yeah.
It's all about fraternity and stuff. So what would be a great current day moment that we could take inspiration from? The 2021 Belgian Grand Prix, where instead of it being a money-grabbing, cynical disaster class from the FIA, we re-portray it as a very brave move from the drivers who say, we can't race. It's just not, the conditions aren't good enough. And the FIA, or the Formula E, who is Alejandro Agag is on the radio going, Alejandro Agag is on the team radio going, no, you have to drive. And they say, no. And it's this complete re-perspective where it's the big bad race directors are trying to make them drive in the rain. They go, no, it's just too dangerous.
And then, like Alan Prost at the 1998 Australian Grand Prix, then the old guy either has inspired totally not Lance Stroll to pull in first, or he pulls in first, and totally not Lance Stroll goes, I'm following him, and then everyone else follows because you know what it is. And we have the great moment. Yes, that is very beautiful idea.
What about the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix?
You want like a Grosjean style crash?
Grosjean style crash.
That would actually fit with the original way Driven did things, so perhaps that would actually be a better choice, yes.
A less funny choice, but probably a natural better. If you wanted to
Actually,
make a good film, then yes, I would agree. Yes.
no,
I'll just-
it's the other way around. What we suggested would be better for a good film, and what Daniel brought up is better for a Driven remake.
maybe so.
I have no idea why you still want to make this a good film.
Well, we want to make a new Driven here. That's the mission statement. Well, obviously, if it becomes a good film, then so be it. But the most important thing is maintaining the spirit of Driven, as if that something is worth preserving. But
For me, it's about making a movie that truly and honestly reflects modern racing, which is why I would end the film with the big championship battle at the season finale at London, and the two main title contenders, whoever the Bo Brandenburg character is in this case, crash into one another, go back into the pits, and then they have to race and do qualifying laps until one of them can get the fastest lap to win the championship.
for the less Formula E familiar fans listening to us, this is the straight reference to the season 2 finale where Sebastian Buemi and Lucas Di Grassi did the very same thing as in Lucas Di Grassi ran I would never say intentionally, into the back of Sebastian Buemi and somehow both crawled back to the pits. And because no one thought it prudent to limit the fastest lap point to the top 10, they then had a mini qualifying for the point for the fastest laps that would end up deciding the championship in Buemi's favor.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, you spoiled it, but I was gonna say that definitely could never happen in real life.
Sorry for explaining the joke.
No. It's fine. I think that's all the ideas I had. At least all the most salient ideas I had for a German. What does it call? Recharged.
Recharge, yes.
Yes.
Will it be set in the beginning of Formula E where they have to do the car changes? Because I feel like they could do a really dramatic version of that.
That would make sense, yes. It would be very good for the close-ups driven love of drivers getting bucketed in.
Yeah, like if you've ever seen the famous, for anyone in our audience who's seen Taken 3, or has seen those famous videos of Liam Neeson trying to jump a fence, and there's like 10,000 different shots. I feel like they could do a lot of those kind of style of like quick shots of drivers getting it. And also, to interrupt myself, the crash that Jimmy Bly has where he has to jump out of his car in the set amount of time, he has to prove in the original Driven that he's race fit. They could redo that to see
before the start of the final race.
That's it.
Pressure test.
They could do that, but they have to test whoever our Jimmy Bly character is in the new film to see how quickly he can get himself strapped into the next film. If he can do it into the next film, into the next car.
The actor who's trying to.
You're already making a sequel to the sequel, not to the remake.
Recharged.
Recharged.
Before I go over my version of the ending, because I have a very interesting reference to real racing on hand, because we have kind of left Daniel out to hang a bit, didn't we? Do you have any suggestions for the recharge driven, or are you just thinking we're insane for trying to remake this mess?
I cannot possibly improve on what you proposed.
Yeah, well, my ending would be as follows, because as we know in the actual movie, the championship was decided by like 4/10. The 4/10,000 of a second, even the slimmest of margins, because obviously also both movies have to have that. Mine would be as follows: in the fact that London would be a bit altered, and that the final corner would be a bit oval-esque, think Bristol, think Martinsville, that kind of stuff. And then final race, final lap, some safety car peers has bunched everyone together, and last lap, last chance. And what our totally not Lance Stroll does is he uses the fact that Formula E cars aren't fully open wheelers. Like you don't immediately destroy everything if you have contact with something, be it a wall, be it another car. And then he rides the wall like it's a video game to end up having just enough speed to finish ahead of the totally not Bo Brandenburg.
That also totally never happened in real life.
Not even remotely. Should I explain the joke again, or do we trust our people to know their NASCAR?
No, our audience are very educated, Lennart.
Then we won't explain the joke.
Yeah, I also would add that the movie should have at some point, it should have a crash between relatives or former world champions who crashed between themselves as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. We can have this because every Hollywood movie has to have these now. The comedy, or at the very least, every Disney movie has to have those. Two comedic relief guys who somehow are world-class racers, but do stupid stuff all the time to make people laugh, because heaven forbid someone doesn't laugh during a Disney movie.
Indeed. I've just maybe to end this section and also the podcast itself, but I was thinking of the famous scene, as you brought it up, Lennart, the famous scene at the end of Driven where there's a montage leading up to the final Grand Prix. Who would you have in your... If let's imagine it's set in the first year or two of Formula E, who would you have in your montage?
Well, obviously, we would want people that are at least somewhat known, even beyond just the ultra hardcore racing fans. I would go with the drivers from his first season, Takuma Sato, obviously, the 2 times Indianapolis 500 winner. I had to mention that, yes.
It's such a household name.
Sebastian Buemi, obviously. And, well, for a bit of irony, we could take the real version of whatever driver our totally not Lance Stroll is, and other than the Joe Tando equivalent is referring to, as in either Massa or Villeneuve. And, well, what's a good one, a good last one? Lucas Di Grassi for the Brazilian market, because Brazil has a lot of money and we want that money. As in the movie studio. So, yeah, those would be good.
That's true. I was just thinking like how they could put in the most obscure drivers in the same kind of positions, because during the montage, for those who haven't seen the film, like there's a scene where Juan Pablo Montoya is sitting in his garage, sort of fully focused, staring at the wall, and one of the other drivers is like saying goodbye to his kids as he puts on his overalls and stuff. And it's like...
Obviously, one name we have to have for obscurity's sake, because we can always squeeze in a second of reject material, is none other than the great Salvador Duran. I totally didn't look up his given name right now.
Yeah, we'd have Salvador Duran. We'd have
Catherine Leck. We could also have.
Catherine
she actually
Leck,
did 2 races. Oh, Jesus Christ! I'm having the driver list right now, and there are some beautiful names. Michela Ceruti.
Oh, you don't remember that person?
Alex Fontana.
There's all sorts of no-hopers here. Sam Bird.
Ho Ping Tung. Chinese market, gotta have some.
Because it's a modern film, we really need Catherine Leck, because of course we need a woman.
Yes,
in the film.
Oh yeah, that was also be one thing that we make the totally not Lance Stroll, Flavio Briatore, every team principal ever mix. Obviously needs to be a strong female character, so obviously this will be Genna swept as well, but thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah, also I was just thinking about the comedic relief character. It could be someone like Jaime Alguersuari, who wants to DJ everywhere he goes in the paddock or something like this.
Awesome.
Perfect. So the Daniel Ricciardo Alguersuari Memo Marino mix is like, at the end of the film, he's like, after this race, I'm going to retire. I'm going to become a DJ. And then he shows a picture of his kids and his wife, and he's like, And then there's like the horrible crash, at Spa. We'll have it at Spa. We'll mix the two things up, and we'll put the crash at Spa.
Formula E cars at Spa, awesome.
Well, the one thing I really should have mentioned, we should really end this podcast, but one thing I really should have mentioned is, of course, there are no real circuits. Every circuit shown in the film is an amalgamation of at least 4 circuits.
Like how they sometimes the season finale, the actual race, you see a lot of that Circuit Genève, even though it's supposed to take place in Detroit, which in itself doesn't make sense because it's Detroit in November, which isn't particularly warm either. So
I thought it ends in Japan, didn't it?
Japan was like in the middle of the season. That was where he had this late crash, and where Bly had the late crash trying to chase down Brandenburg. And I hate myself for knowing all that off the top of my head. Like even earlier, there was a mistake which you made where you said it was Joe Tanto who went after Memo Moreno after he had the big crash, and I knew myself. And Jimmy Bly was the one who stopped, and then Bo Brandenburg followed him after his fiancée asked him to. And I had to. No, you're not bringing that up now. You're already way too much of a nerd about this goddamn movie as it is.
I think it's wonderful.
And of course, you have to remember, I also wrote this huge-ass gravel trap, which is one of my longest of all time, where I went into everything. Oh, here was this detail, and that was actually like it is in real life, because some parts of Driven are realistic. Oh my, this fucking movie.
Do you need a hug?
I think I do, yes. Thank you for the offer.
And on that bombshell, should we close our 3-way podcast?
Yeah, so I think we should. And of course, we want to especially thank everyone for listening. And of course, we want to very much thank Daniel for joining us. We are, as we have promised in the early part of this, we're going to link to his YouTube channel where he does an interesting Let's Play of Grand Prix 2, where he showcases the career of his great Spanish driver, was it?
Yeah,
Alfonso de Vinuesa.
Yeah, Alfonso de Vinuesa. Yeah, just in real life, a very unlucky driver who suffered a terrible crash at Spa. We were talking about.
I didn't want to say the name because I don't know how to.
That's the correct way of saying it.
And of course has a great music selection. We will also link to his Spotify in the description. And as I said, thank you very much for your time, everyone. And obviously, thank you to Jeremy as well for his ever persistent contributions to gprejects.com. But that mustn't go unmentioned.
No worries. Book review coming soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Anyway.
Thank you so much for having me.
And of course,
this has been fun.
The fun has been all mine as well. And it's an honor to have worked with you and ideally work with you in the future and have everyone take their time to listen to us. But we cannot leave without the most important lesson of them all. Where teammates are close, teammates collide.